The night I turned off my phone and walked away from my family, I told myself I would not cry. I had already cried enough for people who never once asked if I was okay. I had given them 7 years of my early adult life, more energy than I had, more forgiveness than they deserved, and more silence than was good for me. When I finally left, I did not leave with anger. I left with a very quiet, very tired kind of peace. Then 7 years later, my phone buzzed once at 11:47 at night. Then again. Then again. By the time I picked it up, there were 43 voicemails sitting in a row, all from numbers I had not heard from in years, and every single one of them needed something from me. Before I tell you what those voicemails said and what I chose to do next, I want to ask you something. If someone who once treated you like you were invisible suddenly needed you more than anything else in the world, would you answer? Think about that, because I had thought about it for 7 years without even knowing I was preparing for that exact moment. Stay with me, because this story does not go where you think it will. My name is Emily, and I want to be honest with you from the very beginning. I am not someone who gave up easily. I am not someone who walked away from her family without trying first. I tried for years. I tried in ways that embarrassed me to think about now. I made excuses for people who never made room for me. I showed up to events where I was not really wanted. I called people back who did not pick up my calls. I sat at dinner tables where the conversation moved around me like I was a piece of furniture someone had forgotten to throw away. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else, because I need you to know that the Emily who finally went no contact was not someone who gave up too soon. She was someone who waited so long that the waiting itself became its own kind of damage. I grew up in a family of 5. My parents, my older brother Marcus, my older sister Diane, and me. On the surface, we looked like a normal family. We had a house with a yard. My parents both worked. We ate dinner together most nights when I was young. There were birthday cakes and Christmas trees and a dog named Pepper who lived to be 15. From the outside, it probably looked like something warm. But families have insides that the outside never shows. And the inside of mine was something I spent most of my childhood trying to understand, and most of my adulthood trying to survive. The pattern started early, though I did not have the words for it until I was older. Marcus and Diane were older than me by 4 and 6 years respectively, and somewhere along the way, in the economy of attention that every family runs, I became the one who cost the least. Not because I was bad, not because I caused trouble. Actually, I think partly because of the opposite. I was easy. I was quiet. I figured things out on my own. I did not throw tantrums or demand things or create scenes at the grocery store. My parents praised me for this in a way that, as a child, felt like love, but that I now understand was really just relief. I was manageable. I required very little maintenance, and so they gave me very little maintenance. And then they gave Marcus and Diane more of everything because those two actually asked for it. Marcus was the one my parents called talented. He played basketball through high school, and my father never missed a single game, not even the away games 2 hours out of town. He drove through rain and traffic, and once through a winter storm that had half the county staying home. My mother would pack food for the trip. They would come home buzzing, happy, still talking about what Marcus had done in the second quarter. I remember being 12 years old and sitting at home with a babysitter, eating pizza from a box, doing my homework at the kitchen table, and wondering if any of the plays Marcus made that night were as interesting as the short story I had written for my English class that my teacher had called one of the best pieces she had read from a student in years. She sent a note home. My parents nodded, said that was great, and moved on to whatever Marcus had planned for the weekend. Diane had her own currency. She was beautiful in the way that made adults pay attention to her, and she learned young how to use it. She was social and confident, and she made my mother proud in the way my mother most wanted to be made proud, which was in front of other people. Diane's life was lived as a kind of performance for the extended family and the neighbors and the parents of other kids at school. My mother lit up when Diane walked into a room full of people. She would introduce Diane first, brag about Diane's activities, share Diane's news. I was often introduced second, or sometimes as an afterthought, and occasionally not at all if my mother got distracted mid-sentence. I want to be fair. My parents were not cruel people in obvious ways. They did not hit me. They did not tell me they hated me. They fed me and clothed me and kept me warm and sent me to school. What they did was something quieter and in some ways harder to name. They made me invisible in the particular way that only the people who are supposed to see you the most can manage. They looked through me when Diane or Marcus were in the room. They celebrated me in private, but never in public. They came to my graduation, yes, but they left early because Marcus had something going on that afternoon that my father said he could not miss. My mother hugged me quickly in the parking lot and said I had done so well, and then they were gone, and I stood in my graduation gown holding my diploma alone in a parking lot while my classmates took photos with their families around them. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I understood. I told myself that this was just how families worked, that some kids naturally got more attention, that it did not mean anything serious about how they felt about me. I told myself that story for years. I was very good at that particular story. I moved away for college at 18 and I discovered something important. When I was not around my family, I was fine. More than fine, actually. I made friends easily. I was good at my schoolwork. I had opinions and ideas and people found me interesting to talk to. I was not the invisible girl at the edge of the room. I was a person. A real, full person. It sounds like such a small thing to realize about yourself. But when you have spent your whole childhood being told, through 1,000 small silences, that you do not quite count, discovering that you actually do count feels like the first real breath you have ever taken. I studied business and finance. I worked part-time through college to cover what my scholarship did not. My parents helped Marcus pay for a full apartment when he moved to a different city after his brief and ultimately unsuccessful attempt at a professional sports career. They helped Diane with a down payment on a house when she got married at 25 to a man named Gerald, who my mother loved because he wore nice watches and knew how to talk to her in the way she most liked to be talked to. When I graduated college with honors and no debt, I had done it without any financial help. My mother told me she was proud of me. She said it on the phone while Diane was visiting her, and I could hear them talking in the background about what to make for dinner. I said thank you and got off the call and went back to my life. I built my career in accounting and financial consulting. I was good at it and I worked hard. By the time I was 26, I was making more money than my father had ever made in any year of his working life, though I had never said that out loud to anyone in my family because I knew how it would land. I bought my own apartment. I built my savings carefully. I invested wisely. I was, by any practical measure, doing extremely well. I was also very lonely in the specific way that comes from carrying the weight of a family that does not see you clearly. I kept trying, I kept calling. I kept showing up for Christmas and Thanksgiving and the occasional birthday. I kept sending gifts for other people's children. I kept asking how everyone was and meaning it. I kept being the one who remembered dates and details and things people had mentioned in passing. I was the keeper of the family's small history, the one who could tell you what year a thing happened and what everyone had been wearing and what had been said. No one kept the small history of me. The year I was 28, something happened that started the real unraveling. My mother was diagnosed with a heart condition that was serious but manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. The doctor was clear that she would be fine if she followed the plan. My father called me in a panic and I flew home immediately. I took 2 weeks off work without being asked. I organized her medications. I drove her to appointments. I researched her condition and printed out notes and talked to her doctors and made sure she understood everything. I cooked healthy meals and I cleaned the house and I helped my father navigate the paperwork for the insurance claims. Marcus called twice. Diane came once for 2 days, stayed at a hotel, and spent most of her time there making comments about how the house needed to be repainted and whether my mother should really be eating what I had cooked for her. When my mother's condition stabilized and everyone could see she was going to be fine, my parents took the whole family out to dinner to celebrate. It was a good restaurant, nicer than where we usually went. My father ordered champagne and gave a small toast. He thanked Marcus for his emotional support from far away. He thanked Diane for dropping everything to come home. Then he raised his glass to my mother's health and sat down. I had been their foe. Our 2 weeks. I had done everything. I was not mentioned. I sat with my champagne glass in my hand, and I smiled and I drank, and I did not say a word, because by then I had spent so many years practicing the art of not saying the word I most needed to say that the silence was as natural as breathing. Later that night, when we were alone briefly in the kitchen, my mother said quietly that she did not know what she would have done without me. She said it low, like a secret. I thanked her and I went to bed. The next morning, she told Diane she had no idea how she would have gotten through it without Diane's support. I was standing 6 feet away. Neither of them looked at me. I drove home 3 days later and I cried the entire way. Not about the lack of credit, about finally seeing the pattern clearly enough that I could no longer explain it away. The next 4 years were an exercise in slow realization. I kept trying to be part of the family, but I started watching more carefully. I started noticing things I had been too willing to excuse before. I noticed that every family conversation revolved around Marcus or Diane. I noticed that when I shared good news, it was received briefly and then redirected to something happening in their lives. I noticed that when I had a hard time, my parents would say the right words but not actually do anything. I noticed that Marcus borrowed money from my father more than once, and that my father gave it without question, while the one time I mentioned that I was having a stressful financial month during a period when one of my major clients had delayed a large payment, my father said that I had always been good at figuring things out, and he was sure I would land on my feet. I noticed that Diane got help and input and involvement in every life decision she made, while mine were either ignored or questioned as if I might not know what I was doing. I noticed that my birthday was consistently forgotten or acknowledged a week late with a text, while Marcus and Diane had their birthdays organized as events. I noticed, most of all, that when I tried to talk about any of this, the conversation was immediately shut down. My mother would say I was being sensitive. My father would say the family had always done its best. Marcus would say I was always making things harder than they needed to be. Diane would say with great patience, the kind of patience that is really just another word for dismissal, that I needed to learn to see the good things people did rather than focusing on what I thought they didn't do. I tried one real, honest conversation with my mother when I was 31. I sat down with her at her kitchen table on a quiet Sunday afternoon and I told her, as calmly and as specifically as I could, what I had been feeling. I did not use big emotional language. I gave her specific examples. I told her about the champagne toast. I told her about the graduation. I told her about years and years of small moments that added up to a weight I was carrying alone. I was not cruel. I was not angry. I was honest and I was specific, and I asked her if she could help me understand whether I was reading things correctly or whether there was something I was missing. She cried. She said she had never meant to make me feel that way. She said she loved all her children equally. She said the family was not perfect, but that we all loved each other. She held my hand across the table and told me she was sorry I felt that way. Then 2 days later, she called Diane and told her that I had attacked her at the kitchen table and made her cry by listing all the ways the family had failed me and that she was very worried about my mental state. I know this because Diane called me the next day and told me, with her patient voice, that I needed to consider therapy because clearly I had a lot of unresolved anger that I was directing at the people who loved me. Marcus sent me a text that said simply that I needed to stop hurting Mom. That was the end of my trying. I did not make a dramatic exit. There was no screaming phone call. There was no final letter. I simply stopped calling. I stopped showing up. I stopped sending birthday texts. I stopped being available. I answered briefly when directly contacted, and then I contacted a therapist, a very good one named Dr. Osei, who helped me understand over the next 2 years what I had been living inside and what I needed to do to stop living inside it. And slowly, very slowly, I let myself become a person who was not organized around the approval of people who had never truly given it. The no contact, when it became complete, happened over about 8 months of decreasing contact. By the time I was 32, I had effectively ceased to have a family. It was quiet and it was painful, and it was also the most honest thing I had ever done for myself. Here is what I did during those 7 years. I worked. I built my consulting practice into something significant. I hired 3 people. I grew a client list that included small businesses, mid-size companies, and eventually a few larger corporate accounts that I had pursued carefully and won through sheer quality of work. By the time I was 35, my practice was generating more revenue in a year than most people I knew would see in a decade. I was not showing off. I was not trying to prove anything. I was simply finally able to put all the energy I had been spending on a family that did not see me into things that actually grew. I also healed, not quickly and not perfectly. With Dr. Osai's help and then later on my own, I learned what had happened to me and why it had felt so confusing for so long. I learned about emotional invisibility and what it does to a person's sense of worth. I learned that being easy and manageable in a family does not make you loved more, it just makes you less visible. I learned that the approval I had been chasing was not something those particular people were ever going to give me in the form I needed, not because I had done something wrong, but because they did not know how to give it. Understanding that did not make it hurt less, but it made it make more sense. And sense, even painful sense, was something I could work with. I bought a house at 34. A real house, not an apartment, a house with a garden in the back and enough room to have a home office and a guest room I had not yet needed. I had a circle of close friends who knew me well and cared about me genuinely. I had one relationship that was important to me, a man named Daniel who I had met through work and who was patient and thoughtful and who, crucially, actually listened when I spoke. We were not married. We had our own spaces and our own independence. But he was real and present and good to me, which was more than I had often had. I was not perfectly happy. I do not think anyone is perfectly happy. But I was genuinely fine in a way I had not been in my 20s. I was grounded. I was clear. I was mine. And then on a Tuesday night in October, 7 years after I had last spoken to my mother, I set my phone on the nightstand at 11 and went to read for a bit before sleeping. At 11:47 the first buzz came. Then another. Then my phone lit up and kept lighting up, and when I finally picked it up and looked at the screen, I saw the notifications stacking, one after another, voicemail after voicemail, incoming calls from numbers I had blocked redirecting to voicemail anyway, because I had never thought to block the voicemail box itself. I sat up in bed and I counted. 43 voicemails between 11:47 p.m. and 1:15 a.m. I did not listen to them that night. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and I sat in the dark for a long time. Then I turned on the light and I picked up my book and I read until my eyes got heavy and then I slept. I want you to understand that that took real practice. The Emily of 10 years earlier would have been on the phone within minutes, panic helping whoever needed something, no matter the hour. The Emily who had spent 7 years building herself back up was able to breathe slowly in the dark and decide to respond on her own terms. In the morning, I made coffee first. I made it the way I like it, slowly, with care, in a small French press that I had bought at a market 2 years earlier. I took it to my back garden even though it was cold, because the garden in the morning is one of my favorite places. I sat there with my coffee and I prepared myself. Then I went inside and I sat at my kitchen table and I started at the beginning. The first voicemail was from Marcus. His voice was strange, tight and high and not quite like himself. He said that there had been a situation and that Dad was in the hospital and that I needed to call back. He did not say please. He said I needed to call back. The second voicemail was from Diane and she was crying, not the kind of crying she did when she wanted something. Real crying, ragged and breathless. She said Dad had collapsed. She said it was serious. She said the doctors were talking, but she did not understand what they were saying and she needed me to help her figure out what was happening. She said she had been trying to reach me. She said she knew it had been a long time. She said please. The next several voicemails were repeats of the same essential message from Marcus and Diane, with increasing urgency, and some with an increasing edge of frustration, as if my not answering immediately was something I was doing deliberately to them in a crisis, as if 7 years of silence meant they could still expect me to be available at midnight. Then there were voicemails from numbers I did not recognize, which turned out, as I listened, to be Gerald, Diane's husband, and a woman I did not know named Patris who introduced herself as Marcus's current girlfriend, both of them asking me to call back. And then, voicemail number 31, a voice I had not heard in 7 years, my mother. She sounded small and frightened in a way that was very different from how she had sounded in my memory. She said my name, just Emily, at the start, and then a long pause as if she was trying to gather herself. She said that Dad had collapsed at dinner and that the ambulance had come and that they were at the hospital and that she was scared. She said that the doctors were using words she did not understand. She said that she needed me to come, not asked. She said she needed me to come, and that she was sorry, and that she knew a lot of time had passed, and then she said something that I had to play back 3 times to make sure I had heard correctly. She said, "I should have listened to you at that kitchen table. I should have listened." I sat very still in my kitchen for a long time. My father had collapsed from a cardiac event. He was alive, but it had been serious, and the doctors were monitoring him closely. This was the information I was able to piece together from the voicemails and from a search of the area hospital that turned up a phone number. I called the hospital directly, not my family. I asked about my father by name and explained that I was a family member who had been out of contact. The nurse was kind and gave me what she could, which was not much beyond confirmation that he had been admitted and was in the cardiac care unit. I sat with all of that information. I sat with my second cup of coffee getting cold beside me. I thought about the 43 voicemails. I thought about my mother's voice. I thought about Diane crying for real. I thought about Marcus, tight and high and not quite himself. I thought about 7 years of silence that I had built carefully and lived inside carefully, 7 years of actual healing, and I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be. And here is where I need to stop and tell you something important, because I think some people expect a story like mine to go in a certain direction at this point. They expect the woman who was wrong to stay hard, to close the door completely, to say that they had made their choices and now they could live with them. And I understand that impulse. I felt it. There was a version of me sitting at that kitchen table who could have set the phone down and gotten on with her day and been perfectly justified in doing so. But that was not the version of me that I had built. I had not gone no contact to punish my family. I had gone no contact to protect myself. Those are different things. I had left to become someone who was not organized around their approval, not to become someone who felt nothing. I had done 7 years of real work to understand the difference between protecting myself and being cold. And when I sat at that table and thought about my father in a cardiac care unit and my mother, scared and small and saying she should have listened, I realized that what I did next had to come from my own values, not from the wound. Because if I acted from the wound, then the wound was still running me. And I had worked too hard to let that happen. I called Daniel first. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things about him I have always valued. Then he asked me what I felt like I needed to do, not what I should do, not what was expected of me, what I felt like I needed to do. I told him I thought I needed to go. He said that sounded right, and he asked if I wanted him to come with me. I drove to the hospital the next morning. 4 hours in the car, alone, through early autumn countryside that was just starting to turn color at the edges of the trees. I spent 2 of those hours in silence, and 2 of them talking out loud to myself, working through what I was going to say, and what I was not going to say, and what I was willing to do, and what I was not willing to do. By the time I pulled into the hospital parking structure, I had a clear sense of my own ground. My mother was in the family waiting area when I arrived. She had aged in 7 years in the way that people do when life does not go gently, and she looked smaller than I remembered, and when she saw me come through the doorway, she made a sound that I did not expect, and she stood up quickly and crossed the room. She did not say anything. She just held on, and I let her. I put my arms around her and I held on too, because whatever was complicated between us, she was my mother and she was frightened, and I was capable of both holding her and being honest later. Diane came down the hall from wherever she had been and stopped short when she saw me. She looked like she had been crying for a day and a half. She said my name, and I said hers, and there was an awkward, suspended moment, and then she came forward and hugged me too, not the way she usually hugged, which was performative and light, but in the gripping way of someone who is genuinely afraid. Marcus came in from outside, phone in hand, and when he saw me, he stopped. He looked different, heavier in the face, with the particular look of a man who has spent some time living harder than he had planned. He said, "Hey, Em." I said, "Hey." We stood there for a second, and then he nodded, and I nodded, and that was the reunion. The doctor came out to speak to us that afternoon. My father had experienced a significant cardiac event, meaning a serious heart attack. He was stable now, but he would need a procedure and then a serious restructuring of how he lived, his diet, his medications, his stress levels, his activity. The doctor was a compact, efficient woman named Dr. Hartwell who spoke in clear, organized sentences and paused to make sure people understood. My mother kept looking at me when Dr. Hartwell spoke, because I was the one in the room most likely to understand the information and translate it into something useful. I asked the right questions. I wrote things down. I asked about the procedure timeline and the recovery expectations and the medication protocol and the follow-up care plan. When Dr. Hartwell finished, I stayed behind and asked 2 more questions that I had held back while the family was in the room because I did not want to alarm them unnecessarily until I had a clearer sense of the situation. Then I went back out to the waiting area and I explained, as clearly and as calmly as I could, what was happening. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then my mother said, "I knew you would understand it. I knew you would know what to do." She said it in a way that was meant as a compliment, but that landed on me differently because it was the same thing she had always said. Emily would figure it out. Emily would know what to do. Emily was competent and capable and would handle the difficult parts. The difference was that I was not 28 anymore, and I was not going to slide back into the role of the invisible family problem solver without naming what I was doing and why. That first evening, while my father was still being monitored and we were not yet able to see him, we sat in the waiting room together. At some point, Diane asked quietly why I had not come back or why I had gone in the first place. She asked it without accusation, just tiredly, like a real question. I looked at her for a moment, and then I said that I had needed to protect myself and that I hoped at some point we could have a longer conversation about what that had meant and why. She nodded slowly. She did not defend herself, which surprised me. Marcus said nothing for a long time, and then he said gruffly that he was glad I came. I said I was glad too. That was all. I stayed for 3 days while my father had his procedure and began his initial recovery. I organized the medication schedules. I arranged follow-up appointments. I talked to the hospital social worker about resources for post-cardiac recovery and brought my mother a printed summary of what she would need to do and watch for when my father came home. I did all of this not because it was expected of me, not because I was trying to earn anything, but because I had made a choice to be there, and I was going to be there fully. On the 3rd day, when it was clear my father was going to be okay and was beginning to be irritable in the specific way that means someone is feeling better, my mother asked if we could talk. Just the 2 of us. We went to a small family lounge at the end of the hall that was empty at that hour, and we sat across from each other at a small table, which felt like a strange echo of the kitchen table conversation 7 years earlier. She told me she had thought about what I had said, back then, many times over those 7 years. She said she had not wanted to believe it at the time. She said it had been easier to think I was being dramatic than to sit with the idea that she had done something genuinely wrong. She said that Diane, over the years, had said some things that had made her think about it again. She said that she had been proud of me for so long, but that she had never known how to show it in the right way, that she had always assumed I was fine because I had always seemed fine, that she had not understood until much later that my seeming fine was something I had learned to do because she had not made enough space for me to be anything else. She said she was sorry. She said it like she meant it, not as a performance, just as a fact. I sat with that for a moment, and then I told her the truth, which was that I believed her, and that I accepted her apology, and that I was not the same person who had left. I told her that I was willing to have some kind of relationship going forward, but that it would have to be a different kind of relationship than we had before. It would have to be one where I was actually seen, where I did not show up and make myself small, where I could say a hard thing and have it heard instead of turned against me. I told her that I was not interested in going back to being the family's invisible problem solver. I was interested in being her daughter, actually her daughter, with a seat at the table that was as real as everyone else's. She cried again, but this time I did not comfort her immediately. I let the words sit in the room, and when she had gathered herself, she said yes. She said that was what she wanted too. She said she was so sorry for so much time. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers and I held it for a moment, and that was the beginning of something new, which was not the same as the old thing repaired. It was new, smaller and more careful and built on things that were actually true. I drove home on the 4th day. My father was well enough to be moved out of cardiac care and into a regular room, and there was family enough there to handle the next stretch. As I drove, I thought about the 43 voicemails. I thought about the years they represented. I thought about the fact that crisis had been the thing that finally cracked open a door that all of my trying had never been able to move. There is something painful about that fact that I did not try to deny. The people who had not made space for me in ordinary time had called for me 43 times in a night of emergency. That is its own kind of story. But here is what I had that the Emily of 28 had not. I had clarity. I was not going back out of guilt. I was not going back out of fear of what they would think of me. I was not going back because I needed them to finally see me the way I had spent so many years needing. I was going back, carefully, on my own terms, because I had chosen to. Because my values included choosing compassion when I could afford to, and I could now afford to. I had spent 7 years making sure I could afford to. In the weeks following, things shifted in small and significant ways. My mother called me on a regular Tuesday afternoon just to talk, not because anything had happened, just to hear my voice. She asked about my work with real curiosity. She asked about Daniel. She asked about my house. She listened to the answers and she responded to them. It was small, but it was real. My father called once from his recovery to thank me, in his clipped way, for coming. It was not an eloquent call. He said he was glad I had been there to talk to the doctors. But it was the first time he had ever called me just to thank me for something, and I could hear that it had cost him something, and I accepted it for what it was. Diane and I had a longer conversation about a month later. She told me that over the years she had started to see things she had not seen when we were younger, that she had recognized the pattern I had tried to name at that kitchen table, and that she had not been willing to acknowledge it then. She said she was ashamed of the message she had sent me after our mother had called her, the one telling me to go to therapy because of my unresolved anger. She said it had taken her a long time to understand that the anger had not been unresolved, it had been completely reasonable, and that she had been part of what created it. She asked if I could forgive her. I told her that forgiveness was something I was working on, not a thing I could deliver as an instant gift, but that I was willing to move forward if she was committed to showing up differently. She said she was. I believed her somewhat, and I kept the rest of my belief in reserve to be earned over time. Marcus was the hardest. He did not call. He sent a text eventually that said something approximately like, "I know things were messed up and I should have been different." I texted back that I appreciated him saying that and that I hoped we could talk properly at some point. He said yeah, that was where we were, and I was okay with that. I had stopped needing Marcus to be something he had not yet learned how to be. I held the door open, but I was not standing in the doorway. There was something else I need to tell you, because I said earlier that the 43 voicemails did not go where you might expect. The family reunion, if you can call it that, was only part of the story. The other part came about 6 weeks later, when my father was home from the hospital and recovering, and the practical conversation began about what needed to change. My parents were older now. My father's health required genuine restructuring of his day-to-day life. My mother could not manage everything alone. The question of who would help and how was real and unavoidable. What emerged over several phone calls and a family conversation that I participated in by video, because I was not ready to be in a room with everyone yet, was something I had not anticipated. It turned out that Marcus had significant financial problems that he had not told anyone about. He had borrowed money over the years from several places, including from my parents, more than I had known, and some of those arrangements were now creating strain. He could not contribute money to the parents' support. He could barely manage his own situation. This came out slowly, over multiple conversations, and each time it came out a little more clearly until eventually the whole shape of it was visible. Diane's situation was more complicated. She and Gerald had a comfortable life, but Gerald's business had taken a serious hit over the past few years, and their finances were not what they looked like from the outside, which was a fact that Diane had been protecting carefully because her identity was built so much on the performance of comfort. She could contribute some, but not as much as the situation realistically needed. And then there was me. I had built 7 years of quiet, careful, serious financial security while the rest of the family had been living at the edge of their means or beyond them. My business was solid. My house was paid for in large part. My savings were real. I had not built all of that to be generous with people who had not seen me, but I also had not built it to be stingy out of old pain. I had built it to have choices. And now I had a choice. I hired a financial planner who was not connected to my family in any way, a neutral professional named Carolyn who had no stake in my decisions. I laid out the full picture for her, and we talked through what was realistic and what was not, and what I was willing to do and what I was not willing to do. Then I came to the family conversation with a clear proposal. I would contribute to my parents' care financially and practically, but in a structured way with clear terms. Not as a blank emotional account that people could draw from whenever they needed something and ignore when they didn't. As a specific, limited, defined commitment with agreed responsibilities on all sides. I would help cover the costs of my father's medical follow-up and a portion of any in-home care they needed as his recovery continued. I would make this contribution for a defined period with reviews built in. In exchange, I wanted 3 things. I wanted my contribution acknowledged openly to the family, not hidden or minimized or credited to someone else. I wanted regular, honest family communication about the actual situation, no more performances of everything being fine when it was not. And I wanted my role in the family to be treated as real, not as something to call on in emergencies and ignore the rest of the time. Diane agreed immediately and looked slightly ashamed. Marcus agreed with a nod that I could tell cost him. My mother said yes to everything with a quickness that told me she had been waiting for someone to organize things clearly. My father, speaking from the couch in the living room where I could see him through the camera on Diane's phone, said that sounded reasonable. It was not warm, it was not an emotional breakthrough, but it was honest, and it was equal, and it was mine. The first acknowledgement happened at Christmas. I went home for the first time in 7 years for the holiday, which was its own strange experience, like walking back into a house from a dream to find that the furniture has been rearranged, but the walls are the same. My mother cooked. The house smelled the same, that particular combination of pine and whatever my mother put in the pots that I had not smelled anywhere else since I was a child. My father was thinner and quieter, with the particular gentleness that sometimes comes over people who have been very close to something serious and lived through it. At dinner, before the food, my father stood up, which he did not do easily, and he said that he wanted to say something. He said that he had been doing a lot of thinking while he was recovering, and that one of the things he had thought about was how the family had handled itself, not just recently, but for a long time. He said that Emily had come when she was called, and that Emily had done more for this family over many years than had been properly recognized, and that he was saying so now because it was true and because it should have been said a long time ago. He sat down. He did not look at me, but he had said it. There was silence for a moment, and then my mother said yes, and Diane said yes, and Marcus cleared his throat and looked at his plate and said yeah. I looked around the table at these people who had been the shape of my world before they became the reason I had to leave it, and I felt something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite love and not quite peace, but was something in the direction of all 3. Something quieter and more durable than any of those words. I felt like a person sitting at a table she had finally been truly invited to. Not out of need, not in a crisis. At a Christmas dinner, in the house I had grown up in, with the pine smell and the food and the father who had finally said out loud what I had needed to hear. I did not cry. I am not sure what that means. Maybe it means I had already done the grieving for the year's tea. Hat could not be given back. Maybe it means I was too busy feeling present to feel sad. I sat there and I ate my mother's food and I listened to the conversation move around the table, and this time I was in it. And I felt, for the first time in a long time in that house, like one of the people who was actually there. I want to tell you something about what happened after that Christmas, because the story does not end neatly at one dinner. Life does not end at one dinner. The recovery of a family relationship is not a single moment. It is 100 small moments that either build something real or expose that nothing has changed. In the months after Christmas, I watched carefully. Not suspiciously, just honestly. I paid attention. My mother called regularly, not only when there was a problem. My father sent me a text on my birthday that arrived on the actual day. Short, practical, like him, but on the day. Diane and I had several real conversations, the kind where something true was said and received without being deflected. She was trying. I could see it, the effort in her voice sometimes, the way she would catch herself before changing the subject, the way she would come back to a thing she had moved past too quickly. It was imperfect. Real things are imperfect, but it was real. Marcus remained the hardest. He did not have many words, and the words he had were not often about the right things. But he did something one afternoon that I did not expect. He called me from his apartment, and he talked for almost an hour, not about himself, but about me. He asked me what my work was like. He asked me about Daniel. He asked me what I liked about my house. He stumbled through the questions like someone reading from a language they had just started learning, but he asked them, and he listened to the answers, and at the end he said he was glad I was okay. He said it quietly, like he was saying something private. I told him I was glad he called. I meant it. I am 39 now. I have a business I built alone. I have a house with a garden I love. I have a man beside me who listens when I speak. I have a therapist who has watched me rebuild and who I do not see as often now, but who I know is there. I have a family that is still complicated and still imperfect and is more honest now than it has ever been with me. I have a clear sense of my own worth that I built in 7 years of silence and that nobody can take away from me even when they want to. And I have the memory of 43 voicemails on a Tuesday night and what it felt like to decide, slowly, in the morning, with coffee, on my own terms, what I was going to do about them. Here is what I know because I have thought about it enough to be sure. Healing is not the same as forgetting. Going back is not the same as starting over. Choosing to be present with people who hurt you does not mean pretending they did not hurt you. You can hold the truth of what happened and still decide to move forward. Those two things are not opposites. They are just both true at the same time, which is uncomfortable, and which is also just what real life looks like. I am not going to tell you that everything is beautiful now. Some things between me and my family are repaired. Some things are still in process. Some things are simply the permanent record of how they were. I live with all of that simultaneously. But I live with it as a person who knows her own worth, who made her choices consciously, who built something real and protected it, and then, when she was ready and when it was right, chose to open the door a little wider. Not all the way, a little wider. Because I got to choose that. Because I had built the kind of life where I got to choose. The 43 voicemails did not break me, and they did not fix everything. What they did was give me the chance to find out who I had become, and I liked who I found. The evidence of that is in everything that came after. In my father's words at the Christmas table. In my mother's regular calls. In Diane's effortful honesty. In Marcus's stumbling hour-long conversation about my life. In the family meeting where I laid out a structured arrangement, and it was accepted without argument because my terms were fair and clear, and I was not willing to accept anything less. In the way I drove home after that Christmas with the windows down a little even though it was cold, feeling something I can only describe as whole. I want to be clear about something that I think is important. I did not win because my family finally gave me credit. I won the moment I stopped needing the credit to feel complete. What happened after that, the voicemails, the apologies, the acknowledgement at the dinner table, all of that was real and it mattered, but it was not the foundation. I was the foundation. Everything I had built in 7 years of quiet, of therapy, of hard work, of honest friendships, of a love that saw me clearly, that was the foundation. The families. Recognition was not the ground I stood on. It was just a good thing that happened once the ground was already solid. That is the part that took me the longest to understand. You do not wait to become whole until the people who made you feel broken finally see it. You build yourself whole first. And then, from that wholeness, you make your choices. I want to ask you something before you go. If you have ever been the one in your family who was easy to overlook, the one who handled things quietly, the one whose needs got moved to the bottom of the list because you never made enough noise about them, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me this. What was the moment you realized you had been making yourself invisible? Because for Emily, it was a champagne toast at a restaurant where her name was simply never said. Everyone has a moment like that, and everyone deserves to talk about it.